faith, and that's often what we focus on when we study this chapter. But within those stories of those heroes of faith, there's also another thing that the writer of Hebrews wants us to know. And one of the first places that we see that is in the 10th verse of Hebrews chapter 11. Here the writer has just told us the story of Abraham and Abraham's great faith, and then he tells us concerning Abraham in verse 10, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And then the writer of Hebrews goes on to tell us about the faith of Sarah. And then we get to verse 13 of chapter 11, where he summarizes everyone that he's talked about before: Abraham, Sarah, Noah, Abel, and others. In verse 13, he says concerning all of them, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So he talks first in verse 10 about Abraham looking towards a city. And then he says in verse 16 that God has prepared for them a city. And one of the things that we see concerning God very early on in the story of the Bible is that God is a God who provides. And one of the things that God provides is God provides a place. We see this first in Genesis, and after completing the creation and having created Adam and then Eve, the very next thing that God does for them is he prepares a place for them in the Garden of Eden. And then when God looked upon the earth and decided that he'd had enough and that it was time to destroy everything that he had created and start all over again, he took the man that he had chosen in Noah and he prepared an ark for Noah and his family, a place for them to be saved. And then when we get to the story of Abraham, amongst his many promises to Abraham is the promise of a land that we know that Abraham was able to walk in. He was able to see it, but he was never able to own it as his own. His children had to wait hundreds of years for God to create that nation, to bring them out of Egypt, and to bring them to the place that he had prepared for them. And then when they arrived there, God tells them, I'm going to designate a city, and I'm going to make my name to dwell in that city. And we get introduced to the idea of Zion, a place where God's people dwell and where God dwells with his people. And it's a place that we sing about even now in many of the songs and hymns that we sing in praise to God. And then when we get to the story of Jesus, again, the idea of God through Jesus preparing a place. As Jesus prepares to depart and to leave his disciples behind, he tells them that I'm going to prepare a place for you, so that where I am, there you may be also. God is a God who prepares a place for his people, and all these heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, their conduct, the faith that they demonstrated, showed that they were not claiming this world and this life as their home, that they were looking towards that place that God would prepare for them. And then in verse 39 of Hebrews chapter 11, we read, and all of these, and the list has grown even more from Noah, Abraham, Sarah, all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. They were looking forward to promises that they did not receive. They were demonstrating their faith and waiting on the promises that we now have. And then in chapter 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. I want you to first notice what the writer says about Jesus and how he describes him in verse 2 there. He describes him as the founder and perfecter of our faith. Why did he need to say both? It's perfectly fine to say that Jesus is the founder of our faith. It's perfectly fine to say, too, that Jesus is the perfecter of our faith. Why did he choose to use both? He chooses to use both because in using both, there's a sense of completeness. We talk about Jesus being our all in all, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the founder and perfecter. In another translation of the Bible, the term that is used there is the author and the finisher. And you think about all that you can imagine as you consider describing Jesus in that way as the author and the finisher of our faith. Jesus in that sense becomes like a man who sits down to write a story. The author of any story is deciding how that story is going to go. But Jesus is not just the author. He's not just someone who is separate and apart from the story that he wrote. He's the finisher also. He entered into our story by coming to earth and being willing to die on that cross. So as we look towards 2024, let us look to Jesus. Let us each day lay aside the sin which can weigh us down, repenting of our past ways, waking up renewed and ready to serve God in the new year. The invitation of the gospel stands open today, and all who are willing can come as we stand and sing.